The screech of tires and the wail of sirens still echoed in Fire Chief Jackson Reed's ears as he pulled into his driveway after a 14-hour shift battling a warehouse inferno that nearly collapsed on his crew. He was running on 2 hours of sleep, 3 cups of burnt coffee, and a heart full of pride that every one of his firefighters made it home safe. But as he reached for the door handle of his official fire command truck, his mobile office, his response hub, his lifeline, his hand grasped nothing but air. The truck was gone, vanished. His front lawn looked freshly raked, the concrete still bearing faint tire marks. At first, he blinked, disoriented, wondering if exhaustion had finally broken his mind. But a bright yellow note taped to his door snapped him back into focus. Your vehicle has been removed for violating HOA visual standards. Non-compliant vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. HOA enforcement. Jackson's eyebrows rose so high they nearly merged with his suit-streaked hairline. This wasn't just any truck. That was a federally registered emergency operations command vehicle stocked with communication relays, evacuation maps, medical gear, and citywide hazard schematics. And the HOA had towed it for not being pretty enough. Jackson clenched the note and exhaled slowly, walking back to the spot where his truck had stood for the past 4 years without a single complaint. It had reflective striping, a municipal seal, and a mounted light bar. Not flashy, not obnoxious, but practical. And now it was gone because someone didn't like how it looked. A neighbor across the street peeked nervously from behind a curtain. Another one quickly closed their garage. And then came the voice he hoped he'd imagined. Finally, someone's cleaning up this eyesore, called a smug tone from the sidewalk. Jackson turned to see Karen Withers, president of the HOA, arms crossed triumphantly like she just led a crusade against an invading army. That truck was dragging down the property values, she chirped. I had it handled. You're welcome. Jackson's jaw tightened. That truck, he said, enunciating each syllable like it might stop him from yelling, is a state-certified mobile command unit. Removing it is not just illegal, it's reckless. Karen blinked, feigned a yawn, and said, then maybe park it somewhere people don't have to look at it while sipping their morning tea. Before Jackson could reply, his radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice cut through the tension. Chief Reed, we've got a 10 to 91. Possible chemical fire at Lincoln Middle. Hazmat already en route. Need field command ASAP. His breath hitched. Lincoln Middle, hundreds of kids, dozens of staff, and his truck, the hub for command, communication, and coordination, was in the wind. He grabbed his backup handheld from his belt, but the range was limited. His laptop with floor plans, gone with the truck. The command beacon in the missing rig. With a furious shake of his head, he bolted toward his personal car, heart pounding not from exhaustion now but from dread. Karen watched with a smug shrug, completely unaware that she had just potentially delayed a life-or-death emergency response. Minutes later, Jackson arrived at the scene to a maelstrom of flashing lights, choking smoke, and sirens. Without the command truck, setup was slow, radios crackled with static, and coordination between hazmat, fire, and EMT units fractured under the strain. He made it work because that's what fire chiefs do. But every second wasted gnawed at him like embers under the skin. Later that night, after the fire was controlled and the kids safely evacuated, he sat on the hood of a scorched ambulance, exhaustion replaced by something sharper, anger, cold, precise anger. The next morning, the tow yard opened at 8:00 a.m., but Jackson was already there by 7:30, uniform pressed, hat under his arm, badge gleaming. The manager, chewing a donut and barely glancing up, asked, Name? Jackson replied, Chief Reed. I'm here for my city vehicle. That got the guy's attention. He led Jackson to the back where the fire command truck sat surrounded by dusty sedans. Its lights were unplugged. The emergency beacon was disassembled and tossed into the back seat. Worse, the dashboard computer that stored decades of emergency mapping data was missing. Jackson took out his phone and began snapping photos. Who authorized this tow? He asked. Said HOA president. The manager shrugged. Lady called us up. Said it was some unauthorized junk. We didn't know it was emergency equipment. Jackson took a breath. You're going to need to prepare a statement. This just became a legal issue. Back at City Hall, Jackson requested a meeting with the municipal legal office. He laid out the photos, the note, and a detailed timeline. He wasn't seeking revenge. He wanted accountability. The assistant city attorney, a wiry woman with tired eyes, took one look at the evidence and muttered, "Good God." They towed an operational emergency unit without clearance. Jackson nodded and stripped it of assets. "That's tampering." She leaned back, took a deep breath, and said, "We're opening a case." Later that evening, Jackson stood outside his home as neighbors trickled by, hesitant but curious. Word had spread fast. Some whispered apologies. Others said they were too scared to speak up against Karen. Jackson didn't blame them. HOAs could be relentless, but this wasn't about bickering over lawn gnomes. This was bigger. This was about a civilian authority thinking it could override the law. As he walked toward the HOA meeting scheduled for that night, he didn't wear his badge or his turnout gear. He wore his full formal uniform, the gold braid catching the hallway lights, his campaign hat tucked under his arm, and a copy of the municipal code in his hand. When he entered the room, all conversation ceased. Karen, seated at the head of the table like she was queen of the cul-de-sac, smiled politely. "Chief Reed," she said sweetly, "nice of you to join us. I hope you've come to clear up the misunderstanding." Jackson smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I'm here to clarify something," he said, unfolding the code book. "Specifically, that your board violated 3 state ordinances, 2 federal property clauses, and the city's emergency response protocol." Karen's smile faltered. Someone at the back muttered, "Oh damn." Jackson looked around. "And because of that, your actions caused a delay in our response to a hazardous materials incident at a school. That delay may have directly contributed to injuries sustained by a firefighter. You didn't just tow a truck. You compromised public safety." The room went dead silent. He paused, then added, "I'll be seeing you again, but next time it won't be at a meeting. It'll be in court." As he turned to leave, the only sound was Karen's breathing. Shallow, quick, and very much not smug. The HOA had picked the wrong truck, the wrong moment, and absolutely the wrong guy. The fire was only just beginning. Jackson left the HOA meeting without another word, his boots clicking down the hallway like a gavel striking judgment. He didn't need to slam the door. The weight of his final sentence had already knocked the wind out of everyone in that room. As he stepped into the cool night air, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline was fading, but underneath it simmered something else: resolve. He had been through collapsing buildings, wildfires, and gas leaks, but nothing prepared him for the sheer audacity of suburban politics fueled by unchecked arrogance. And now it was personal. The next morning started early. The firehouse was buzzing with controlled energy. But as Jackson walked in, the conversations dimmed. His crew had heard what happened. His command vehicle being towed wasn't just inconvenient. It was a failure in the eyes of those who trusted the system to back them up. One of his lieutenants, Taurus, walked up and handed him a tablet. "News is starting to catch on, Chief," he said. Jackson looked down. The local news had picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA tows fire chief's emergency truck, delays school fire response." Below it was a still from the tow yard of his truck, red lights unplugged, surrounded by broken glass and bent antennas. The story was spreading like wildfire, and unlike actual fires, this one didn't need oxygen, just outrage. Jackson knew what had to be done. He gathered every document, registration papers, municipal asset records, the vehicle's designation orders, and even federal fee-made documentation proving it was eligible for disaster operations. He printed out the HOA note and highlighted the phrase "unauthorized vehicle." He attached timestamps from the fire response and the tow yard photos. Then he called the assistant city attorney. Within 2 hours, they had filed an official complaint. But Jackson wasn't stopping there. He contacted the state fire marshal's office to initiate a review of HOA practices that could endanger emergency response. And then he made one more call, this one to the city's audit committee. Karen had pulled a thread she didn't realize was connected to the entire emergency services infrastructure. That evening, Jackson arrived at the fire station again, this time with a reporter from Channel 9 trailing him. The city had authorized a press statement. Cameras rolled as he stood in front of the damaged command vehicle, his voice steady and composed. This vehicle is not a personal truck. It is a vital emergency response unit designed to save lives. The decision to remove it without authorization jeopardized our ability to protect this community. It won't happen again. The clip aired during prime time. Social media did the rest. Comments poured in. Some blamed the HOA for overreach. Others shared stories of similar HOA madness. Jackson didn't engage, but he did notice something interesting. A former HOA board member named Diana privately messaged him. She had left the board 2 months ago. "They don't follow their own rules," she wrote. "I resigned because Karen was making executive decisions with no vote. I have proof." Jackson met Diana the next day at a coffee shop near City Hall. She brought a manila folder thick with emails, financial documents, and board meeting transcripts, some of which hadn't been shared with the community at large. One email stood out. It was from Karen to the towing company, dated 2 days before the truck was removed. In it, she wrote, "I don't care if it's the Pope's vehicle. That ugly red truck is going, and I want it out before the neighborhood tour next week." It was premeditated. This wasn't about rules. It was about image. She wanted the truck gone for a real estate showing. Jackson now had intent. The very next day, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Karen insisted on calling it a transparency session to calm the public. Flyers had been distributed claiming the whole issue was a misunderstanding. But Jackson showed up with more than just a presence. He showed up with documents. As the meeting began, Karen launched into her usual polished speech. But the moment Jackson stood up, the crowd quieted. He handed packets to the board and began to speak. "This isn't about parking," he said calmly. "This is about deliberate obstruction of public safety and fraudulent misuse of authority. I now have evidence that the tow was ordered with full knowledge of the vehicle's status." Karen tried to interrupt, but the board president, whom until now had stayed silent, raised a hand to stop her. Diana, sitting quietly in the back, nodded once and stood too. "I resigned because of this type of behavior," she said. "I warned Karen not to touch that vehicle, and she called it an eyesore in a sea of elegance. She knew." Gasps followed. Some neighbors whispered. A few took out phones. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as she tried to regain control. "These accusations are outrageous," she stammered. "We have bylaws, and I was simply enforcing them." Jackson replied, "Yours don't supersede state law, city emergency codes, or federal designation of disaster response vehicles. You crossed a line, and you endangered lives." The board called for a recess. Outside in the hall, residents crowded Jackson, offering support. One older man said, "She fined me for having a ladder showing in my garage window." Another woman added, "She told me my son's wheelchair ramp made the block look cluttered." Stories spilled out, a domino of grievances. What Karen had done to Jackson wasn't isolated. It was a pattern, and now the cracks in her rule were wide open. When the board reconvened, the vice president announced that an independent auditor would be appointed to review all HOA decisions made over the past year. Karen protested, but the murmurs in the room made it clear her power was slipping. That night, Jackson returned home to find a thank you card taped to his door. No signature, just the words, "You finally stood up to her. Thank you." He walked inside, poured himself a glass of water, and stared out the window. The spot where his truck once sat now held his personal car, but the symbolism lingered. It wasn't about a parking space. It was about someone believing they were untouchable and learning too late that public safety does not bow to private ego. The following morning, he received a call from the fire marshal. "We finished our preliminary review," the voice on the other end said. "And you were right. The HOA is in violation of multiple codes regarding fire lane obstruction and hydrant clearance. We're freezing all construction approvals effective immediately." Jackson thanked him and hung up. The momentum was building. One truck had been towed, but the damage was far from done. Karen had lit a match thinking she was in control of the flame. But now the fire was spreading, and Jackson had just turned on the fan. Karen had never faced pushback like this before. For 4 years, she had ruled the HOA with manicured precision and a voice coded in passive aggression. She had fined people for having garden gnomes, repainted community signs without a board vote, and even banned a local Girl Scout troop from selling cookies because she thought the uniforms clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. But now she wasn't the one giving orders. She was the one under scrutiny, and the panic was showing. While she tried to maintain her usual plastic smile composure in public, behind closed doors she was scrambling. She sent out mass emails to residents insisting that the issue with the fire chief's truck was a gross misunderstanding, then followed it up with a defensive letter accusing Jackson of publicly slandering the HOA with malicious intent. It backfired spectacularly. Half the community ignored her letter. The other half forwarded it to the local news. Channel 9 ran a follow-up piece titled, "HOA Doubles Down on Fire Truck Towing, Community in Uproar." By now, Jackson had stopped trying to manage the media. He had bigger priorities. The city's legal office had approved preliminary proceedings for a formal investigation into the HOA's conduct. They were also compiling documentation of every fire code violation within the HOA's jurisdiction. Jackson was asked to assist. He spent hours reviewing hydrant locations, access roads, and reports of blocked lanes, all things the HOA was supposed to maintain. What he found was worse than expected. 2 hydrants on his street had been hidden behind decorative rock walls. One of the fire lanes near the park had been converted into an unofficial overflow parking lot. The worst offense was the installation of a wrought iron fence across the only access path to the community's eastern green belt, a space routinely used as a wildfire buffer zone. All of it had been approved by Karen. All of it violated code. Jackson compiled the violations into a detailed report, which he submitted to the fire marshal. The next morning, Karen was served with a cease and desist notice, halting all HOA-sponsored modifications to common property. When she read it in front of the neighborhood committee, her hands visibly shook. But the unraveling didn't stop there. An anonymous whistleblower mailed a packet to City Hall containing copies of checks written from the HOA budget to Withers Property Solutions, a company with no website or business license. A quick investigation revealed that it was a shell company registered under Karen's son's name. Jackson wasn't surprised. The signs were all there. Private contractors hired without bids, payments never recorded in meeting minutes, and a patio renovation outside the clubhouse that somehow cost $12,000 for 4 benches. The city assigned a financial auditor, and within days, Karen's house of cards began to collapse. A quiet but significant moment came when 2 HOA board members resigned publicly and endorsed a full re-election. Their resignation letters included statements about being misled and pressured into backing illegal decisions. The community, once too intimidated to speak up, now rallied around the truth. Meanwhile, Jackson returned his attention to what mattered most, restoring the command truck. He coordinated with city engineers to repair the damage from the tow yard. The beacon was replaced, the laptop reinstalled with encrypted backups, and the emergency radios recalibrated. He personally checked every component before signing off. But more than the equipment, it was about restoring trust. The command truck was a symbol now, not just of emergency response, but of resistance to tyranny hiding behind rules. As the final test was run on the truck's onboard systems, Jackson stood quietly watching the red lights strobe against the station walls. Torres walked over, handing him a clipboard. "She tried to gut our lungs," he said, referring to Karen, "but she forgot we're the ones who run it to fire. We don't scare easy." Jackson nodded. "She went after us with paperwork. We fought back with law and accountability. But even with the truck restored and the violations exposed, there was still unfinished business." Jackson had yet to confront Karen one-on-one. Their past interactions had always played out in public settings, within meetings or brief exchanges on sidewalks. Now, with the backing of city officials, the fire marshal, and the court system preparing to file charges, Jackson decided it was time. He requested a formal sit-down, not as a fire chief, but as a resident. She agreed, likely hoping to spin her version of events one last time. They met in the clubhouse conference room. Karen arrived wearing her usual pastel blouse and pearls, her expression forced into something resembling civility. Jackson was already seated, arms crossed, expression neutral. She opened with flattery. "I'm so glad we could speak like reasonable adults," she said. "So much has been blown out of proportion." Jackson didn't answer. He simply slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of the damaged hydrants, copies of the fraudulent invoices, and a still from the tow yard showing his truck without its beacon. Karen blinked, her voice faltering. "You have to understand, I didn't know." Jackson interrupted, his tone like steel. "You knew. You ordered it. You bragged about it. You endangered lives. And you did it for vanity. But I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to tell you that your reign ends now." Karen's composure cracked. "I've done everything for this community. Everything I do is for its good." Jackson leaned forward. "Then explain how stealing from the HOA budget serves anyone but you. Explain how compromising fire lanes helps residents. Explain how delaying a response to a school fire protected anyone." She said nothing. Her silence was the loudest confession. Jackson stood. "The audit team will be here tomorrow. I recommend you prepare." The next day, the audit team arrived with boxes, laptops, and sharp eyes. Karen was not present. She had submitted a written leave of absence, citing mental and emotional stress. The interim board met that evening to vote on a permanent leadership change. By unanimous vote, Karen was removed as president. A replacement was named, someone known for their transparency, calm leadership, and collaboration with city departments. Jackson didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. His presence had already changed everything. That weekend, the fire station hosted a barbecue open to the entire neighborhood. It was meant to be a morale booster, a gesture of goodwill, and a celebration of unity. Jackson stood at the edge of the lot, watching kids play near the trucks, residents laughing with firefighters, and volunteers giving out burgers. Tourists came over, pointing to a wooden sign placed near the driveway. "You see that?" Jackson turned to read it. It was hand-painted and freshly bolted to the ground. The words were clear, bold, and impossible to miss. "Reserved for Fire Chief Reed. Towing this vehicle will trigger a full city response." Jackson laughed, the sound deep and real. For the first time in weeks, the fire wasn't in his chest. It was in the grill, in the community, in the shared sense of relief that the tyrant was gone. The OOA hadn't just towed a truck. They had tried to drag a symbol of service through the mud, but the people had drawn a line. And this time, the fire chief didn't just put out the flames. He lit the path forward. 2 weeks after the barbecue, the neighborhood felt different. There was a calmness that hadn't existed in years. People waved again. Sidewalk conversations resumed. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches without anyone reporting them. But underneath that surface peace, the fallout from Karen's actions continued to ripple outward. The city audit was in full swing now, and the findings were worse than anyone had anticipated. Dozens of invoices were flagged as suspicious. Contractors had been paid for services that were never rendered. Landscaping charges were inflated. A walking trail Karen had claimed to be funding out of her own pocket turned out to have been billed through the HOA budget 3 times under different names. Every stone the auditors turned over seemed to reveal another layer of manipulation. And as the findings grew more damning, the city attorney's office began drafting a formal criminal complaint. Karen wasn't just being removed. She was facing prosecution. Jackson watched all of this unfold from a distance. He hadn't set out to bring Karen down. At first, all he had wanted was to get his command truck back and make sure it never happened again. But every arrogant decision she made, every code she broke, had built a path that led exactly to this moment. He was scheduled to give testimony soon, not just as a fire chief, but as a resident and witness. When the city's legal department called to confirm the court date, Jackson didn't feel nervous. He felt ready. Meanwhile, Karen had gone almost completely silent. Her once daily HOA mails had stopped. Her house, once the centerpiece of the neighborhood with flower baskets and manicured hedges, now had yellowing grass and a recycling bin tipped over for 3 days straight. She wasn't answering her door. Rumor had it her son had quietly left town, possibly worried about being dragged into the investigation over the fake company. For someone who thrived on control, silence was the loudest thing she had ever said. But the case wasn't over yet. Jackson had one more concern. The fire safety issues exposed by the HOA's mismanagement weren't unique to just his neighborhood. If one HOA had this much power and so little oversight, how many others across the city were endangering lives in the same way? He brought his concerns to the fire marshal. After reviewing the audit findings, the department launched a citywide survey of fire access compliance within HOA-managed communities. It was a massive undertaking, but it had already yielded results. In another suburb, a similar fire lane obstruction had nearly delayed EMT access to a heart attack victim. Jackson's case had opened the floodgates, and what had started as a personal fight now had citywide implications. Back in the neighborhood, the new HOA leadership, led by a woman named Elise Tran, began repairing the damage Karen had done. Elise was everything Karen wasn't: patient, transparent, and willing to listen. She invited residents to a town hall meeting and actually let them speak. One man stood up and thanked her for removing the HOA's ban on tool sheds. Another woman wept as she told the room that Karen once tried to fine her for leaving her porch light on past 10 p.m. Jackson attended quietly, seated in the back, just watching. At the end of the meeting, Elise spotted him and asked him to speak. He didn't want to, but the room encouraged him with gentle claps and hopeful faces. So he stood and kept it simple. When the truck was towed, I didn't just lose equipment. I lost time. That time could have cost lives. I've served this city for 22 years, and I've never seen such recklessness from someone in a position of community trust. But I've also never seen neighbors come together the way you all did after. That matters. This community stood up and said enough. And now we're stronger for it. Applause followed him out the door, and this time he felt like it wasn't for what he represented, but for who he was. Not the fire chief, just Jackson, the guy down the street with the red truck and a dog who barked at sprinklers. Speaking of which, when he returned home, there was a group of neighborhood kids drawing chalk flames on his driveway. His dog, Rusty, was watching them from the porch like a judgmental grandparent. One of the kids saw Jackson and ran up to him, proudly holding a stick with a foil-covered tip. "We're pretending to put out fires like you," the boy said. "I'm the chief." Jackson smiled, knelt down, and handed him a spare red helmet from his garage. "Then you need the right gear," he said. The boy's face lit up like it was Christmas. He ran back to his friends, shouting, "He gave me a real fire chief helmet." Jackson watched them for a moment longer, then turned to see Elise approaching with a clipboard. She thanked him again for attending the town hall and informed him that the HOA had voted to create a new position, a liaison between emergency services and the HOA board. "We want you to be the first one," she said. "You be our direct line to the fire department, and also make sure we never make the same mistakes again." Jackson considered it. He hadn't planned on getting involved in HOA affairs long term. But maybe this was the exact kind of oversight communities needed. Someone grounded in logic, duty, and service. He accepted on one condition: "You'll let me repaint the fire lane along the curb. And this time, we put a plaque on it that says why." Elise agreed without hesitation. As night fell, Jackson sat on his porch watching the kids finish their chalk masterpiece. It now included a fire truck complete with hose, ladder, and big bold letters on the side: "Rescue." One of the moms waved from across the street and mouthed, "Thank you." And Jackson, for the first time in a long while, felt something return to his chest. Not rage, not duty, but peace. The fire had been put out. The ashes were being swept, and in their place, something better was being built. Not with control, but with community. Not by fear, but by trust. And yet, in a quiet corner of his mind, Jackson knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her rarely vanished. They regrouped. They whispered. They plotted their next power play. But now she wasn't invisible. The system had seen her, and so had the people. And if she ever tried to rise again, they'd be ready. The whole block would, because now they had a fire chief on their side, and this time his truck wasn't going anywhere. The courthouse buzzed with quiet tension as Jackson walked through its glass doors, his uniform pressed and boots polished, though not for ceremony. He wasn't here to collect an award or give a fire safety seminar. He was here to testify. The state had officially filed charges against Karen Withers for obstruction of emergency services, misuse of HOA funds, and multiple counts of municipal code violations. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it was full enough. A few reporters sat in the back along with several residents from Jackson's neighborhood, some who once feared Karen and others who once supported her, now sitting with crossed arms and downturned eyes. Jackson took his seat and waited to be called. When the bailiff announced his name, he walked to the stand, placed a hand on the Bible, and swore the oath. Then, without fanfare, he began his testimony. He described the night the command truck was towed, how the HOA's actions delayed his response to a chemical fire at Lincoln Middle School. He explained the truck's role as an emergency command center, its importance during crisis, and the impact of losing it even for a few hours. He spoke without anger, just facts, letting the truth speak its weight. The prosecutor showed the jury photos of the damaged truck and played audio of the emergency dispatch that night. There was silence in the room when Jackson described the injured firefighter who was forced to enter the building without updated schematics due to the truck's absence. Seconds matter, Jackson said. In our world, seconds can be the difference between rescue and recovery. Karen sat quietly at the defense table, her eyes avoiding contact, her once flawless poise now cracked. Her lawyer attempted to paint the towel as a procedural misstep, suggesting Karen had no knowledge of the vehicle's emergency designation. But the prosecutor quickly countered, presenting the email Karen had sent 2 days before the towel in which she explicitly referred to the truck as that ridiculous emergency vehicle. It was all unraveling. By the time Jackson stepped down from the stand, the air in the room had changed. The jury didn't need convincing anymore. They needed a verdict. The trial lasted another 2 days, and when the judgment finally came down, it was decisive. Karen was found guilty on multiple charges. The court ordered restitution to the fire department for damages and suspended her from holding any leadership position in a registered HOA for 10 years. She was fined heavily and issued a public apology, which she read with a trembling voice in front of city cameras. Gone was the smug superiority. Gone was the woman who once claimed to be the architect of neighborhood order. All that remained was someone who had believed herself untouchable until the consequences proved otherwise. Back in the neighborhood, the verdict sent a clear message. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about boundaries, accountability, and the limits of authority. The new HOA board put up a notice on the community board thanking residents for their patience and reminding everyone that trust was earned through transparency. Jackson's role as the emergency services liaison became official, and once a month, he hosted a safety review in the clubhouse, educating residents on things like fire lane access, hydrant clearance, and proper evacuation planning. He didn't do it out of revenge. He did it because people finally wanted to learn. One morning, weeks after the trial ended, Jackson received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just his name typed cleanly across the front. Inside was a single note that read, "You win, but you ruined everything I built." It wasn't signed, but the writing was unmistakable. Karen's bitterness hadn't faded, but Jackson didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had built something all right, but it was never community. It was control wrapped in flowers and bylaws, and it had been torn down by truth, not vengeance. That Saturday, the neighborhood gathered for another community day. This one wasn't about crisis or recovery. It was about moving forward. Kids played games set up by the fire department, including a mini obstacle course with toy hoses and smoke machines. Parents laughed and grilled food, and a local band played soft rock on the clubhouse lawn. At the far end of the lot stood Jackson's fire command truck, fully restored and gleaming in the sun. Residents walked by and admired it, some even asking for photos. On the passenger door, newly painted in crisp white letters, was a small dedication, "In service of those who serve." Jackson stood nearby, speaking with the mayor who had quietly shown up to shake hands and offer his thanks. As the event wound down, a young girl approached Jackson with her father. She was holding a clipboard and wore a vest made out of cardboard with hand-drawn badges on it. "Are you the fire boss?" she asked seriously. Jackson chuckled and nodded. "I guess you could say that." She held up a piece of paper she had drawn herself. It showed a fire truck rescuing people from a burning building, and under it she had written in big crayon letters, "Thank you for being brave." Her dad whispered. She saw the news. Said she wanted to make something for the guy who saved the neighborhood from the bad lady. Jackson knelt down and took the paper like it was a medal. "This is better than any award I've ever gotten," he said. The girl beamed as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the lawns. Jackson stood once again on his porch, his dog Rusty lying at his feet. The sounds of laughter still drifted across the block, carried by warm wind and the occasional sizzle from a fading grill. Jackson's eyes moved to the curb where the command truck sat confidently in its rightful spot. The city had even installed a permanent metal plaque, "Authorized Emergency Vehicle," protected by municipal law. It wasn't about victory. It was about restoration. Karen had tried to use rules to break a system built on service, but the community saw the difference now. They saw what real leadership looked like, not someone barking orders, but someone willing to carry the weight of responsibility even when no one asked him to. And though the chaos had passed, the story would remain. It would be shared at firehouse dinners, whispered over backyard fences, and one day, maybe even become the kind of tale that sounded too wild to be true. The day the HOA towed the fire chief's truck and learned the hard way who they were dealing with. Jackson leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes half closed. No alarms, no sirens, no chaos. Just a street at peace and a man who knew that sometimes you don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight it with facts, patience, and a town that finally decides it's had enough.